Well, research I think can mean a lot of different things for different disciplines. And in my case, I did a PhD in sociology and then taught in a architecture school for many years, and now in a art department where a lot of my work has to do with computers and computer science. So in a way, the research that I do kind of draws from a lot of these different a lot of the different perspectives all at once. But I suppose that for me personally, I guess it sort of has to do with a kind of nagging feeling that the models that we have of the world with which we use to govern the world or make the world um, are somehow broken or inadequate and need some some kind of some kind of revision or some kind of um, transformation, or need to be attacked on some kind of way. And I think that part of the reason people go into research and part of research to do this is a sense, and on one level and in some kind of way, um, that that's the case, and that they have perhaps some perspective on some idea where they can see the seams or the cracks in those models, and they want to investigate those further, see how far they can break them apart, see where they go, see what happens when they pull on these threads in a certain way. And I think almost by definition, I think people who spend their lives doing research in this way have probably had some experience where they felt as if they were right about this in some way, that what they saw or what they were able to produce was true, but that they were perhaps the only one at that time who saw it this way. And so there was a sense of feelings of perhaps you were right, even if uh, those around you, perhaps in some kind of authority, um, told you were wrong. And then maybe over a period of time, you come to have some sense that not validation, but maybe some sort of way where it turns out that you were right after all. Um, and that those I think, are the kinds of experiences which take a long time to gestate and germinate. Right? They're not kind of like one day some great man told you that you should be an astronomer, or that piano fell on your head one day in the middle of the thing, and all of a sudden you're going to sort of do this. I think it more has to do with a kind of um, an interest in seeing the world and describing the world in a particular way, and building that perspective over a period of time in such a way that there's a sense that you may turn out to have been right. At the same time, though, inevitably then there's ways in which uh, you may have thought you were right where it turns out that you were wrong, and that these are equally important kinds of experiences, I think, for any sort of researcher, because research begins inevitably with inductive or deductive research from some kind of uh, hunch, some sort of way in which the tonality of what somebody said, or the strange juxtaposition or blur by which you look at something, seems in some ways kind of hard to pin down, that maybe have more significance than it may at first appear. There may be some ways in which something that you're seeing or hearing, or feeling or doing, may in some way be kind of something essential or critical about way a lot of things are working, and you want to pull on that thread, and explore it. And so there's a I think there's a sense over time by which you come to think about those moments, and whether or not, how much you want to trust those moments, and trust your sense of those moments as something to pursue and something to follow. And so I think those experiences of turning out to be right when we thought we were wrong are ways in which you can have um, a way in which you maybe have some courage to enter into those those experiences more directly, and then the moments which are, if they're even moments, but the experiences which are hopefully equally as common when you're wrong, give you a sense of modesty about that courage, in the same kind of way. So, I guess the way I would answer the question has to do with this more sort of over a period of one's life, right? I mean, I remember when I was an undergraduate, and I know this is for undergraduate. In many ways, I could say that a lot of the really fundamental research questions, at least the way I think of the research questions that I'm working with, continue to work with today, which have to do with, in many cases, the relationships between technology and human culture, society, economics, were ones that the essence of which was formulated when I was an undergraduate, not necessarily with the classes that I was taking, but in some ways against the classes that I was taking. There was a sense that these are the right things to be talking about, but we're talking about them in the wrong way. That these are the important issues, but that the languages that we have and the perspectives that we have at hand are insufficient to what's at stake for these as well. And so, and I think in many ways, I think if you talk to people who have chosen research as a career or a path, they would probably say something similar. That there's in many sort of these core questions that appeared for you at a particular time that are probably closely related to your own personal development and sense of the world and what's it about and what it's for and what's most important, that you continue to work on and continue to work on and continue to work on, and that the topics you might work on. So in my case, for a while, I may be working on issues around architectural design and urbanism for some time. And in my current project the book I just finished has to do with global scale computing infrastructure, and then the next book has to do with robotics and artificial intelligence. And from some perspectives, they may seem like kind of all over the place, but really they're driven by a kind of core set of questions, which one's own relationship to, I think, is again based on the sense of figuring out when you're right and when you're wrong, and learning what to trust, I guess. So my work, as I said, is interdisciplinary from the beginning, and it has to do with my own autobiography. Right, as I said, my doctoral work was in cultural sociology, and from there I taught in architecture and design programs for a long time. Now I'm in visual arts department, writing a lot about issues that are, in many cases, normally the domain of political scientists and computer scientists. But to me, these are really just sort of important perspectives on a set of issues that are really closely related to one another. I think that the way I describe my work and my research to people sometimes is a kind of triangulation between philosophy and theory, design, architecture, and technology and computation, and that oftentimes if I'm speaking to one audience, if I'm speaking to the theory and philosophy audience, I'm the design and computing guy. If I'm a computing audience, I'm the design and theory guy, and vice versa. So I'm always sort of I have an expertise in the other two, but enough that I'm allowed to speak to the one. And it's this kind of shell game, I suppose, where sort of moving the capital around from one to the other that is where I kind of find myself. But as the research, I think there's a kind of maybe there's a kind of I don't know, cubist methodology at work where they're trying to see what really are one constellation of issues about the ways in which how cultures are produced, or how cultures come to form in relationship to the technologies that they use, how those technologies evolve in relationship to the choices, economic, cultural, and so forth, that that those cultures make for them, and how it is that we can in fact design both those technologies, but also the relationships that we have to those technologies, and in turn ourselves as well, as a way of both understanding that dynamic and recomposing it in a different direction. This is a single, this is one storm at work, and so I guess the way to think of the research is possibly sort of trying to see this storm, which is self-moving, from multiple perspectives at the same time, not just so that we could get a kind of higher resolution, 360-degree kind of omniscient view of it, so we could hold it, in a kind of static frame, but that perhaps by seeing it from these different perspectives and techniques at the same time, it would allow us to intervene in it differently. It would allow us to design it differently, to compose with it differently, to do things with it differently. And I think this in some ways goes back to the idea I said before about a sense that the models that we have of the world, and through which we're working with the world, are inadequate. And it may be one way in which we can arrive at better models is not just simply combining the ones that we have, but some way sort of multiplying them or juxtaposing them or subtracting one from another, in such a way that we can see these things as simultaneously a problem of human culture and a problem of the evolution of technology and a problem of how it is that we would design the relationships between these at the same time. And then if we pull on one, the other two inevitably come along with it, and that we can't really work with one without also working with the other. And so perhaps the end result of that would be our models that I can do things with, but then other people can do things with as well. And I think maybe that's one way that might differentiate the kind of research that people like me in arts and humanities do from the types of research sometimes that people in the sciences or social sciences do, which I have tremendous respect for, in that in many cases the result of the research that we do, or the hope of the result of the research we do, are better models by which we can understand data or events or phenomenon. And there may be data that are already apparent and well understood, but how do we interpret them, and how do we make sense of them? What do they mean? What do we do with them? Maybe the more important question than identifying or producing better or truer data on its own right. And I think we need both of these, but I think that's the way my work enters into it. I don't know. Studies is an interesting word in this case. I think the way I would look at this may have more to do with the important processes or events or forces at work in these. And lately I've been working a lot around the importance of platforms and protocols in the history of design and globalization, and the way in which something we might think of as the politics or the theory of design and globalization goes forward. If you think about the standardization of the shipping container in the early 1960s, the standard rectangular shipping container by which everything goes in, they go container ships across the world, that the protocol specification of the shipping container is going to be exactly this big, it's going to be this wide, it's going to be this heavy, it's going to have this sort of tensile strength, and therefore every shipping container will be exactly the same. All the container boats will be the same. The ports that they go through will be of a certain size. The robots that move them off the boat will be a certain size. That in fixing this standard, in a way, the entire global economy of the production and distribution and logistics of objects cascaded away from this. There was no reporters there There was no journalist interviewing the standards guys and saying, what are we going to do, and how is this going to affect Panama, and how is this going to, and what about China? No one could have known, and yet, in many ways, it's these kinds of anonymous events, if you would call them that, that may have far more outsized importance than meetings at the UN, who gets elected president, any of these kinds of things. And so I think there's I guess there's an interest in sort of shifting the perspective here as well. You can think of, one of the things I've become interested in a lot lately is the a kind of emerging conversation around theory of platforms. Platforms, and by that I mean, the software platforms, political platforms, technical platforms. They have, an argument can be made that platforms really have a kind of political and economic importance and efficacy that is equal in some ways to that of states or markets, but it isn't reducible to states or markets. Platforms, and think of Google if you like. Platforms have a way they centralize and standardize the terms of participation. You want to use the system, this is the terms by which you use the system. You want to ship something from one side of the world to the other, you're going to use this size shipping container. You want to use one that's slightly smaller or larger, you're out of luck. So there's a fixing of the terms of participation. And yet once those terms are set up, sort of in what Winsett calls a generative entrenchment, then what people do with them and how the system evolves and grows after that fact doesn't need to be planned, doesn't need to be determined in advance. It doesn't need to be designed. It sort of just goes on its own. In that sense, they are a little bit like markets in that regard. But they're not really one or the other. They're kind of perhaps a third thing. And so, if following on the shipping container, if you look at things like the standardization of TCP/IP, where if you're going to have one computer talk to another, it has to work within this OSI with 7 layers, TCP with 4 layers, stack model by which this hardware and this software will talk to each other in this way. And if they do, then great. You can have the communication between them, and if they don't. Urban grids are a kind of platform. You've got this very simple, rigid, almost stupid rectilinear superimposition on a city, but because it's rigid and simple and brings all things in, it's a kind of generic space, it allows all kinds of tumultuous, self-directed, anarchic flow to take place. Where if it was the sort of idiosyncratic suburban cul-de-sac, windy roads, everything kind of comes to a stop. And so, first, in terms of the studies or events in design and globalization, my interest has been on how it is these kinds of anonymous, invisible, behind-the-scenes kind of deep infrastructural settings that can cohere or congeal into platforms have had a much more important effect on how it is that politics, economics, design, human culture have transpired over the last 50, 100 years in particular, because I think platforms go back at least to the industrial era with standardized screw gauges and these sorts of things, postage stamp standardization, than what we may take to be important human current events of people getting elected and putting ribbons on each other and coming in first place and these sorts of things. In fact, are kind of the effects of things that are much more fundamental going on in this way. And I think in terms of thinking about it for its implications for design and politics, I think one thing, there's a kind of paradox at work in that we might normally think that the way to achieve a kind of democracy of outcomes, where we want a non-hierarchical, democratic, self-directed kind of social situation to result, that an equally democratic and non-hierarchical and non-authoritarian means by which to organize ourselves to guarantee that outcome is the way to do it. We see this with Occupy and other kinds of things. The lesson of platforms may in fact be that the inverse is true. If you think of the urban grid, it may be, or TCP/IP, or the shipping container, it may be that part of the logic of platforms is that there first needs to be this kind of arbitrary, authoritarian, fixed imposition of some kind of generative order in advance, structured in such a way that we can have a kind of universal or generic participation within it. And in doing so, then the things things like the culture of cities, or the liquid flows of the internet, or the open economies of globalization can in fact result. And how that might change our thinking about what the politics of design is of great interest to me, in terms of how we think about protocols to megastructures, to the relationship of cities as systems as cities, and so forth and so on. This is where I think our attention needs to go. I think that, I think that one of the things I learned about giving a TED Talk against TED Talks is that there's a lot of people who think that TED is inadequate, and a lot of people who came out of the woodworks to say, thank God somebody finally said this. And I don't think it's because people have I don't think it's because people don't want there to be an open, and myself particularly, don't want there to be an open and public and robust and easy to participate in kind of discussion about technology and economics and design and these kinds of things, but precisely because we do want there to be a robust public discussion, that the inadequacies of the TED platform, the TED format, are that much more apparent and that much more disturbing, I suppose, in a sort of way. I think that, TED, you have to understand that TED is a media company, right? TED was started by, the guy who ran, big fat internet business magazines back in the day, right? It comes from a .com hype business model that continues to its day. I don't have any personal animosity towards Chris Anderson, but I think that what has happened is that TED has contributed to a situation in which innovation has become a kind of content play, and that instead of these conferences being a situation, in a place where people come to they see something innovative and interesting and inventive, and are thereby inspired by these things. I think TED itself has come to a point where people come to these events in order to be inspired, and in the course of doing so, innovation and invention and all these kinds of things have become formulaic and packaged in such a way that they sort of guarantee this outcome. There's a sort of flipping of the means and the means and ends here. Look, I have a lot of really good friends who have done great TED Talks, and I'm happy to pass them around and say, like, this is a good talk. You should watch this talk. But part of it is because TED is what's there. TED has become such a dominant format for this conversation that if you're someone who wants to share your research, who wants to get your research out to the general public, that's the stage you have to work with. You have to find a way to transform and condense your work, to force it through the needle's eye of this extremely sort of sentimental, manipulative, and cynical format. And if you're someone in the public who wants to understand what's going on, and the only reason that I know anything about what's going on in the sciences is because of pop science popularization one way or another. If you want to be part of this conversation, TED is where you have to go. And so the feeling that there's something wrong with TED, and the fact that the TED is because it, again, because there's there's a strong interest on both sides to have this conversation, and so what's inadequate with it doesn't work. I think another way is that another thing that I think is most I think difficult, sort of speaking to the format most specifically, is that it has less to do in many ways about the types of things that are shown on the TED stage, the types of people whose work is shown, because again I think there's a lot of people, than the way in which the TED format, the TED genre, the TED rhetoric is not only standardized, but is drawn from a kind of what I think is sort of a very American kind of tent revival, evangelical kind of public experience about, that everything's going to be okay, right? It's all going to be okay. We can have all of this radical transformation, but everything will still stay the same, right? We're all concerned about the Southern Hemisphere, but don't worry. Here's Bono. We've got this solar-powered bicycle repair kit hackathon in a box for girls, and it's all going to be okay, right? And it's 15 minutes. You have your epiphany. Then we have a juggler. We have another epiphany. Then we have the kid just cured cancer. We have another epiphany. Then we get the banjo player. Then we have the astrophysicist, and on and on and on and on and on it goes. And but after 2 hours, you have a kind of epiphany fatigue. But the real message is that don't worry. It's all going to be okay. We've got this sort of solved. And so it takes people who show up with genuine interest and concern and curiosity and outrage and want to participate in a discussion, and it spins it into a kind of what I think is a kind of highly manipulative and cynical kind of circus effect as well. And so we need something better than this, because the problems that we have to deal with, the issues around what kind of technological culture we want, what kind of and so forth, demand a much more robust and considered conversation. We need more people to be part of that, and I think TED actually prevents public participation.